Victorian England, 1840s to 1890s. Millions of families. One obsession. Photographs that looked like life, but weren't. The dead, propped up beside the living, smiling, watching, forever. Between 1840 and 1900, photography was expensive. So expensive that many Victorian families would never have an image of themselves while alive. But when they died, when a child succumbed to fever, when a mother did not survive childbirth, when tuberculosis took the father, the family gathered what they had and paid for the final portrait. The problem was that the dead had to appear alive. Photographers developed techniques, eye prosthetics, iron support structures, precise positioning, and the camera captured everything. The perfect illusion of a family gathered together as if nothing had changed. This practice, obsessed with death disguised as life, defines an entire era. Once you know what you are looking at, you can never see these images the same way again. If stories that challenge what you think about death and memory intrigue you, subscribe to the channel. We bring documentaries that explore the darkest sides of human history. Let's continue. Photography arrived in England in 1839, like a miracle. For the first time in human history, light could capture reality without the mediation of an artist's hand. The Victorians became obsessed. But there was a problem. Photography was expensive. A photo session cost the equivalent of weeks of wages for an ordinary worker. This meant that many people would never have a photograph of themselves while alive. They would never leave behind a visual record of their existence. Then death came, and it came often. The Victorian era was an era of death. Tuberculosis killed young adults. Typhoid fever swept through entire families. Infant cholera took children within a matter of days. Women died in childbirth, and when it came, the family gathered what they had and paid for the final portrait, because that was the only chance to have an image of that person. Photography then became not a record of life, but a record of death, a final ritual, a way to say goodbye visually. Victorian photographers developed techniques to transform the impossible into reality, making the dead appear alive. Victorian photographers were not merely technicians, they were illusionists. When a family arrived at the studio with their deceased loved one, the photographer understood that they had an impossible task: to make it seem as though that body was merely asleep, that it was alive. The eyes were the greatest problem. Closed eyes gave everything away. So they developed prosthetics, small glass or metal supports that kept the eyelids open, creating the illusion of a fixed and empty stare. It was not perfect. There was something wrong in that gaze, something that the modern viewer immediately recognizes as death. But for the Victorians, it was enough. It was the illusion they needed. The arms and legs were the second challenge. Rigid bodies could not be positioned naturally. So photographers used iron structures, invisible supports that kept the limbs in place, creating the posture of someone sitting, standing, or reclining. Carefully chosen clothing concealed these structures. The hands were positioned over the lap or the chest, holding flowers that carried a double meaning: beauty and death. The hair was carefully combed. The face was lightly made up to restore the color that death had stolen. And then, the final touch: the camera captured the scene. The exposure took seconds. Seconds in which that body was transformed into an image, into memory, into permanent illusion. The result is disturbing for those who know the truth. But for the family, it was comfort. The photo session was a ritual. The family arrived at the studio with the deceased, and the photographer began the work. It was not only the dead who would be photographed, it was the entire family. The living positioned themselves around the body as if they were in a normal portrait. The mother with her hand on the shoulder of her deceased son. The father standing behind, his hand resting on the back of the chair where the dead daughter was seated. This practice wasn't denial, it was a ritual of visual farewell. The family gathered together one last time, preserved forever on photographic paper. There was something profoundly human in this. It was comfort. It was the chance to have a portrait they might never have had in life. The photographers understood the psychology behind it. They positioned the living in a way that created a composition that appeared natural. The eyes of the living fixed on the camera, the eyes of the dead open but empty, the hands of the living lightly touching the body. Everything was carefully orchestrated, and when the camera clicked, it captured a moment of visual mourning, a photographed goodbye. Afterward, the family took the image home and looked at it every day. For a few seconds, death was suspended. Time stopped. That frozen moment was more real than the absence surrounding them. The practice of post-mortem photography began to disappear in the early 20th century, not because people stopped dying, but because photography stopped being rare. Cheaper cameras, more accessible film. Suddenly, anyone could have a photograph of themselves while alive. Multiple photographs throughout a lifetime. Death ceased to be the only opportunity for visual preservation. In addition, attitudes toward death changed. The Victorian era had a ritualistic and public relationship with death, but as the 20th century advanced, death became increasingly privatized and distanced. Bodies went to hospitals and cemeteries. Families stopped washing the dead at home. Death left the living room, and with it, the need to photograph it disappeared. The images that survived reveal far more than technique. They reveal desperation. They reveal love. When you look at one of these photographs knowing the truth, the impact is visceral. That empty stare is not sleep. It is death. That hand resting on the shoulder is not a casual gesture. It is a farewell. The emotional weight changes everything. And perhaps that is the most important legacy of this practice. It forces us to confront our own relationship with death and memory. The Victorians did something that still disturbs us because it touches something deep, the impossibility of holding on to what we love. The Victorian obsession with post-mortem photography was not macabre. It was human. It was the desperate attempt to hold on to what death stole, to preserve a face, a hand, a moment. And perhaps, as we look at these images today, we're doing the same thing, trying to freeze time. The Victorians simply did it in a more literal way. If stories that explore the darker sides of death and human memory intrigue you, subscribe to the channel. Leave your like and tell me in the comments, if you could photograph one last moment with someone you lost, would you?